Hey everyone, Anders Sundquist here, host of the podcast Lean In. And with me today, I have Shauna Geraghty, Doctor of Psychology and SVP People and Talent at Talkdesk. And we're going to be talking about quality of hire. So, Shauna, before I turn it over to you, I want to say, I really appreciate your qualitative and quantitative background and expertise that you bring to the field. And I know our audience today is going to appreciate the tactical information on quality of hire. So if you're tuning in today and you're investigating how to optimize measuring your quality of hire, whether you're enterprise or startup, tune in, take notes. There's a lot to learn from Shauna. Some great content here that we're going to unpack on why to measure and how to measure quality of hire, because it's a different formula for everyone and different outcomes. But I'm impressed with what I've learned from you so far, and it's been quite a lot. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to you and would love you to share with the audience here a bit about your role and scope at Talkdesk, and then we'll get into kind of how you got into recruiting in the first place.
Sure, sounds good. And thanks, Anders, for inviting me on. I've loved our partnership over the years, and I equally learned so much from you as well. Very passionate about quality of hire, so really grateful to be here. So thank you. So just to frame for the audience, Talkdesk. So Talkdesk is we make call center software solutions. We have about 1,300 employees globally, spread across 20 different countries. And we were founded in 2011. I actually started with Talkdesk right after we were founded in 2012. So as the first US employee. Yeah, it's been a pretty wild ride, but a once in a lifetime experience. I'm so grateful because I've been able to grow along with Talkdesk
Oh
growth.
yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's so funny. The journey we all have into recruiting is different. And I think you have a really unique perspective. A decade of tenure at one company, we always joke in recruiting that it's like dog years, that's a once in a lifetime experience. And with that, you've had, once in a lifetime impact at Talkdesk that includes, many areas of the people and talent domain. And of course, quality of hire is just one segment, but it has a big impact on the business. And so I was brushing up on. There's some great content Shauna's produced, and maybe we can share it in the comments here for the podcast episode. But how and why, sort of the philosophy behind quality of hire. Can you fill us in on holistically what is your TA philosophy, and then how does quality of hire fit in under that philosophy?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the first things, so when I started at TalkDesk, I actually started within the marketing function, and I didn't transition to oversee the talent acquisition function until a little bit later, as 2016. And again, I joined in 2012. And at that time, I had no experience in talent acquisition, no experience in HR. And so I did what I do best, which was research. So I went to the literature to find out as much as I could about talent acquisition. And I also asked our COO to pair me with someone who is excellent in recruiting. So he partnered me with an individual who had scaled a recruiting function historically. His name is Aaron Wilson, and he's phenomenal. And I learned everything that I could learn about talent acquisition in 30 minutes from one meeting with Aaron. And I still am grateful for that meeting
Deep
to
dive.
this
There you
day.
go.
And so what I did, one of the first things that I did was I established what we still use today, which are four talent acquisition pillars. And the four pillars are to drive efficiency, effectiveness, candidate experience, and business outcomes. And nested within one of those pillars has always been quality of hire. So quality of hire, we fit within the effectiveness pillar. And so we've been tracking quality of hire, a version of quality of hire, and driving towards high quality hires.
Wow. Okay, so you have this background, coming in and getting sort of a deep dive really quickly from our friend Aaron here on recruiting, what that means, and then evolving into this, head of role, and quality of hire fits in under one of those pillars. So I want to rewind actually for our audience here. Uh, Quality of hire, I think, has become a recent focus as efficiency has become a recent focus. And there is some content you shared with me, some excellent slides, and I just mentioned those around the shift from quantity of hire. And if you're tuning in and you remember the Zerpa era, just 4 or 5 years ago, of course, growth at all costs. How fast can we grow? How big is our TA team to support this growth at all costs mindset? That quickly changed during, of course, the kind of the tech downturn we saw that wasn't necessarily defined as a recession, but felt like it, I think, in many tech companies, and TA saw many layoffs. And now TA teams are often being asked to measure quality of hire. Sometimes that used to be owned by people ops or different segments of the people umbrella. But can you tell us how quality of hire has evolved as an industry and specifically at Talkdesk, given this recent time frame?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. If we, it's not that long ago, but if we wind the clock back to 2021, the market in particular was in this like growth at all cost motion, and that's because it was so easy to fundraise. And with with that infusion of cash was the expectation that you grow headcount. So companies at that time could not hire fast enough. They were
Yeah.
really focused on quantity over quality. It's very rare that companies were able to balance that speed with quality. Some could, but most were really focused on quantity. And then, about a year or two later, fundraising became a lot more challenging. Most private companies haven't taken a round since that period of time, and if they are, they're taking a down round. And so now companies are shifting from that like hiring at all costs, growth at all cost mentality to more of an efficient growth posture. And with efficient growth, you really are thinking about, how do I do more with less? How do I stretch my dollar? Well, the best way to do that is to find the highest quality person in the world that you can for your company and for that role. So they're focusing a lot more on organizational design, organizational effectiveness, bringing in the right quality talent, maybe even investing in their current talent population. And if that focus has shifted, that also has created a need for them to measure their effectiveness. So now more and more companies are thinking about, like, how do I measure the effectiveness of my recruitment approach? And if our focus is on bringing higher quality talent, then quality of hire is the natural go-to for that.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I totally agree. And I think one of the observations I have is historically, and I'm curious your take on this, is historically quality of hire was owned by more of the HRBP and the business side of things, people ops. This term's, evolving, of course, rec ops, people ops, being focused on operational efficiency now is certainly a focus in TA as a domain. What would you extend onto this observation that the quality of hire used to be measured less by purely recruiting teams, and now we're seeing it owned and participated the measurement actually, and we're going to get into the measurement. If you're tuning in taking notes, keep those pencils out. We're going to have a formula and talk more about that, but let's talk about who participates in measuring quality of hire now versus.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say, you know, back in the day, quality of hire was usually owned by in the post-hire experience. So it was a lagging indicator of quality. So most companies would look at, performance evaluations, things like time to ramp, time to productivity. If you're on the sales side, what's their average deal size? And the reason why is it actually is a very accurate measure of quality. It's just a lagging indicator. So when you're not focused on bringing in high quality talent on the front end, you actually don't need that to measure your recruiting effectiveness. But with that shift, companies are now starting to think about what's a leading indicator or a predictive indicator of quality, and then how do we validate it in the post-hire experience. So looking at measuring quality of hire across the employee life cycle, but the primary owner and driver is now on the recruiting side.
Yeah, yeah, well said. And this is sort of the exciting shift. Our conversation will turn into a little more of the measurable, the quantitative side in the upcoming questions. And so, when we look at, well, first I want to unpack the unit economics, and I was really fascinated. I was really impressed with the granular detail that you have measuring this at Talkdesk, and I think in the industry, like understanding cost per hire per source, understanding where hires come from and the unit economics of that origin. And so, my understanding of this might look like a candidate can be hired from any channel, ranging from an organic application, an internal referral, being sourced passively through a tool that the internal TA team has, agencies. So you have your contingent search agencies, maybe contractors, and et cetera. And there's probably even others. Can you unpack all those channels and then tell us about the degree, the let's see, the spread or the delta in cost per hire per source between all those channels?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just referencing kind of my marketing experience, you can look at a different attribution models.
Yeah.
So on the marketing side, when you think about MQL, marketing teams will often say, let's focus on the last touch attribution, which is what was the last channel that candidate or lead went through that converted them. Or more sophisticated models will take a multi-touch attribution approach. And we know the candidate experience is often not linear. They might, hear about your company through word of mouth and then go to Glassdoor to learn about them. And then they see a LinkedIn ad and they click on the LinkedIn ad and that's how they end up in your ATS. Well, on the recruiting side, recruiting tech hasn't really developed to that level of maturity. And I think partially because most recruiting teams don't actually care that much. They're using that last touch attribution. But most ATSs actually can track this if you configure it correctly. So you can look at how candidates end up in your ATS. So
Wow.
the first time that they enter your ATS, you can look at inbound source. You can also, if you're training your recruiters correctly, they will, when they're adding candidates from their outbound prospecting, they will attribute it to the right source. So if you have the right process and configuration of your ATS, it's actually pretty easy to track
Sure.
cost per hire per source because you know what you're spending on each of those platforms per year. And so you just look at the overall spend and then divide that by the number of candidates that's produced or new hires that's produced from each source. But what we know is that cost per hire per source is intricate, is linked with quality of hire, meaning if you can drive quality of hire, by definition, you're also going to drive down that cost per hire per source. And what we look at is what is the highest quality source. So which source is producing the highest quality candidates and new hires, and also which source is producing the highest quality candidates and new hires at the cheapest cost. And it depends on the team, but in general, for our global recruiting team, that's the referral source. And then for our executive recruiting team, it's outbound prospecting, which makes sense because a lot of their motion is outbound prospecting. So yeah, so those two constructs are linked, and you can track it over time. And we've been able to track it since 2016. I actually think it's easier to do it when you're a smaller team because it's easier to configure your ATS and train your team on how to make sure that you're applying the right source when adding to the database.
Totally, totally. So it reminds me of the phrase garbage in, garbage out, and how
Exactly.
configuring the ATS, whatever ATS you use, and training your team to orchestrate or to collaborate and commit to data integrity is really important because then you have accurate measurements downstream.
Exactly.
So, say more about the other channels. I want to unpack actually a little about specifically on either end of the spectrum, the organic applicant where there's a lot of noise right now, and then the agency, sort of the band-aid solution where a hiring manager or maybe the TA team has signed on an agency to fill a gap, and you're paying these big finders fees. Tell us more about those two unique channels and what you've observed with quality of hire and cost per hire per source.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll start with inbound. So right now, most companies are just getting flooded with inbound applicants. And so the challenge is, how do I surface the signal from the noise? How do I find those high
Yeah.
quality individuals at the top of funnel? And there are tools to help do that. So there are actually plenty of tools right now that are on the market that will look at, your ideal candidate profiles. So what your ideal competencies and constructs are, as well as your job description, and they'll match that with folks that are either already in your database, that your ATS, or that you're nurturing top of funnel. So it'll help to like apply a score and surface those quickly, which is it's amazing for our recruiters because then they don't have to do database prospecting, or worst case scenario, go one by one. So in general, we're seeing a flood of candidates at top of funnel, and by definition that usually means that the overall quality goes down. You don't have to pay to get that flood at the top of the photo at this point because of the characteristics of the talent market. So there's not too many companies that are investing in external sources to drive top of funnel because they're getting plenty. And then and so the cost is low there, relatively low, but the number of hires is also relatively low.
Sure,
So it's
sure.
not a very efficient channel if you want to think about it that way. In terms of agencies, it depends. Depends on the agency, and it depends on the partnership that you have with the agency. You can assume that most agencies charge a 20% placement fee. You can actually quantify the value that an agency will bring to the organization. I've created a construct that's just called cost savings to the business. So I will, look at the total cost to bring in that talent and subtract out the total cost that it would have cost us to bring in that talent. Or you can do the inverse of that. If you're not using an agency, you can say it actually makes sense for us to run recruiting internally because we would save this
Oh,
amount of dollars every single quarter. When we were um, like prior to 2021, we were a smaller organization. I actually built the business case to run recruitment all internally based on that cost savings metric. And my goal each quarter was to save $1 million. So I just basically take every salary of every new hire that we've placed within that quarter, multiply it by 20% because that's what it would have been the placement fee. So that would have been,
yeah.
yeah, what would have been the cost if you outsourced it. And then I subtracted out the fully burdened cost of running recruiting internally. And so if that number, if that resulted in a $1 million savings, then I hit my goal. And we were able to actually do that every single year that we tracked that number. After a while, it became less and less important to us because we built that case for better quality internally and also better quantity internally without using the agency. But there are some agencies that are great and that will yield high value.
And especially for niche roles, I hear that can be a good use of pulling that lever because of the time saved and the expertise that they might have. I wanted so kind of a curveball question. The since the Zerpa era, or really since COVID, I guess, we've seen remote come and go. And now there's a trend in it really depends on the company size, but I'm seeing RTO certainly become more popular for FANG companies all the way down through seed. Hybrid is increasingly popular. I would say there's fewer and fewer pure remote. And this is going to bleed us into the formula for quality of hire. But first, I'm curious when you look at quality of hire as it relates to different work environments, so pure remote, hybrid, and on site. Do you see trends? Unpack this for us.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, companies are focused on RTO primarily as a driver for, being able to observe performance and drive productivity. I think it's very challenging for a manager if they don't have line of sight on their employee to truly know whether or not they're, working at full capacity, whether they're driving the true impact to the business. And we actually saw this prior to COVID when we expanded our workforce in different locations. We had hiring managers based out of San Francisco say it's absolutely impossible to run a team that's split between San Francisco and Utah because how am I supposed to know if my Utah team's working? Well, are they driving results or not? And so at Talkdesk, we've kind of we've adapted prior to COVID over time. We were already 30% of our workforce was already remote pre-COVID because we had an enterprise sales force, marketing teams in the field, and then we were also spread across 7 offices. So each department had team members in all 7 of those offices, and they could have had team members in remote capacity. And you know, there's no difference when you look at performance ratings across those groups. There's no difference in performance across those groups. What I will say is by having a more flexible policy, you can expand your talent pool. And if you can expand your talent pool, you might be able to find higher quality talent faster. Maybe it's the stay-at-home parent who can only work remote because they have to do drop-offs and pickups. Or maybe it's an individual that has a physical disability and can't actually commute into the office. So you're
Yeah.
actually opening up the talent pool. And by definition, if you do that, you should be able to produce higher quality talent faster. And so my hypothesis is that right now it is a strategic advantage for companies that are offering flexible work. But my hypothesis is that they will be able to continue to leverage that as a strategic advantage to bring in higher quality talent faster than if you're limited geographically to a commutable distance to an office.
Right. I mean, and it makes sense, right? The TAM, the total addressable market, is larger the more geos you have if you're hybrid, or if it's full remote, then where you're able to hire, if that's simply in the country of origin, maybe the United States for us on this call, or if you're located in EMEA or what have you. So, I mean, it makes sense. And then, another kind of a curveball question, but observation I'm seeing and I'm hearing from friends and customers in the industry about fraud. I just want to touch on this before we get into the actually measuring quality of hire, the formula and whatnot. But just observations. What are you seeing in general with fraud in interviews, in the hiring process, in the industry now. I think there's a correlation with the use of AI and bad actors from foreign locations, oftentimes countries that have nefarious maybe government entities doing this on their behalf or what have you. I've heard even Wall Street Journal articles of there's, North Korean spy groups interviewing with our tech companies, and they're doing it through IP addresses domestically and all sorts of crazy stories. What are you seeing to inform our audience what to be aware of with
Yeah.
fraud?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm on a customer advisory board. I won't name the company, and that was our hot topic. Is
Oh,
how do you identify fraud and how do you prevent it? So I think that as technology advances, the level of sophistication for these individuals also advances. And obviously, if you don't ask them to walk into an office and you can't verify their identity that way, then
the
there's
social
more and more.
security card and an ID, it's like hard
Yeah,
to do.
exactly. There's more and more opportunities to do it. The way we've thought about it and solved for it is actually in the reference check process. We've leveraged reference check platforms that will verify IP addresses and that have other layers of fraud detection. And we've caught individuals that ended up being for various different reasons not who they said they were, or misled us in the application process. And actually some of them were in like really critical roles. So we do take that seriously. We know, it's a potential. We've seen it, happen to us. I think if you run a very rigorous and standardized process with multiple interviews, making sure that that person is on camera, making sure that you have a rigorous background check process and reference check process, you can limit the exposure. But ultimately, you don't know who you're hiring. They could have multiple jobs, right? And we've seen
Yes.
that happen before.
Yeah.
They could not be living in the place that you said that they said they were living. So there's no way to fully verify in this remote world if people are who they say they are because of the advancement of technology and how crafty some people are. But the best thing that we've done is we found technology to help to limit that. And then we run a really, standardized and rigorous process.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I want to extend on that too. The background check process can be very important. I was unaware of some of those filters or those additional attributes you mentioned. Would love to learn more about that. But I've heard other, in fact, previous guests have mentioned they've leaned into actually optimizing their application process to screen out someone who might be using pure automation to apply, and using the filtering process up front. It reduces the total number of applicants, but they've found quality of applicant to increase, thus resulting in quality of hire increases as well. So check out Jeff Barker's episode from Abnormal Security. I just published that last week, and so we touched on that there. Okay, so without further ado, drum roll please. Want to unpack the formula. So the quality of hire, and maybe let's actually start with the definition and then the formula you use. And so, what are you measuring? And this is what I love. I love the nuanced backgrounds of talent leaders today, and yours especially. Coming from this PhD in psychology and the quantitative skills that you have, you bring this unique skill to the table. And so, for our listeners today, what is the formula you've arrived at, and what might they be able to learn from that specific formula?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll start with how we've defined quality of hire because I think that definition is important. So for us, quality of hire is a metric that helps us evaluate the effectiveness of our hiring process. And it does that by measuring the value or even the potential value that a new hire or a new employee would bring to the company. So we're using it across the employee life cycle. In the interview process, it would be a prediction of potential value, and post hire it would be the actual value that that individual brings. And we would look at the predictive validity of quality of hire, the metric that you're using to predict future performance, belonging, retention, productivity, and alignment. So those are the core components or factors that we're looking at. Now the formula can vary, and you touched on it earlier. For us, it all starts with a process, and to make sure that we have that standardized process so that when we're extracting the data, we can be confident in the analysis of that data that will produce accurate results. So do you want do you want me to walk through our process, or should
Oh
I talk
yeah.
about the formula for? Okay.
Walk through the process. I think this is
Okay.
important, and highlight who participates, because that has evolved. And our listeners are often people leaders, talent leaders, and their direct reports. And so, Yes, who participates, and then of course let's get to that good old math formula.
The equation.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
equation. Yeah, y equals mx plus b.
Yeah, so for us, it starts with what we call high performer modeling, and you can take a very quantitative or qualitative approach to this, which is what I like about it. So you don't have to have a doctorate in an advanced degree to do it. So high performer modeling at its core really is looking at your top performers within either a department or your entire company, and you look at what are their attributes that contribute to their success. So what's their experience, what are their competencies, personality constructs, maybe even core values that separate them from the mid performers or even bottom performers. And that piece is really important because again, you're going to use that as a predictor of future performance. So if you can understand exactly what makes your high performer group different than your mid or your bottom performers, then you can translate that into what we call our ideal candidate profile or ICP. So taking those competencies, that experience, those personality constructs, those values that separate them from their mid or bottom performers to put that into an ideal candidate profile. And that is essentially your blueprint for hiring. If you know that your high performers have this experience, these competencies, this personality construct, and these values, then you can search for that when you're looking for
Yes,
talent top of funnel, and then you can assess for that in the interview process.
yes,
um, and so if you can build your interview process around your ICP, so you're evaluating the same constructs and competencies as your ICP through your interviews, through your reference checks, through sometimes you do a challenge, then that data will ultimately feed into your quality of hire metric. And that will help you predict quality talent, so it can actually turn into a predictive score. So if you didn't want to keep going in that process, you could even end there and say,
wow,
my hiring managers are the best judge of talent, so I'm just going to take the hiring manager interview score and use that as a proxy for quality of hire. And that's an okay starting point. So again, that's a very qualitative way to approach this, and it help leaders think through how to structure the process, how to extract that data in a very clean way, how to train to adherence on that process. And it'll get you a big step of the way. But if you wanted to take it that step further, then you can marry that pre-hire data with post-hire data. And you can do that by just looking at things like performance evaluation or time to ramp, time to productivity. So these are all potentially like proxies for quality, but there are some tools that actually take it a step further and they operationalize it. So we historically use Searchlight to measure quality of hire. They've recently been acquired, and so we had to sunset that solution, and now we're using High People. But essentially, they basically do the same thing where they send out post-hire surveys to the hiring manager and the new hire. And you can set the cadence, so 30-day mark, post-hire survey, and you ask very specific questions. But the questions are things like to the hiring manager, knowing what you know today about your new hire, would you still hire them again? And then the new hire, you can say, knowing what you know today about the company and the role and your manager, would you still accept the position? And you can look at the degree of fit or degree of alignment across those responses, and that is predictor of performance and retention. Some of the tools are also looking at some of those constructs I mentioned earlier. So overall performance, so like scale from 1 to 5, how would you rate your performance? Scale from 1 to 5, how would you rate their performance? They're also looking at belonging, alignment, enablement, and then from there deriving an actual quantitative qualitative higher score. That's actually pretty accurate. It's pretty predictive of potential future fit. And so I would say the last thing I would say is the final piece to all of this is that if you are taking a post hire measure, that you want to make sure that you can feed it back into the model, so your pre-hire assessments have that predictive validity. So you
yes,
can say, okay, like, are my hiring managers actually good at assessing quality in the interview process? Maybe it's my recruiters, maybe they have higher predictive validity than our hiring managers, or maybe it's the score on their challenge, or maybe it's the reference check process. So making sure that you find out which part of your interview process has the highest predictive validity And then you can use that to make sure that you're refining your quality of hire metric over time so that it's adding that, or it's having that direct link to the business outcome, which is, performance, time to ramp, time to
So,
productivity.
so how much, if someone, let's talk to the audience member who might be just starting from scratch, building a quality of hire formula and implementing this in an organization. What would be your advice to them on where do they start to get to what you just described?
Yeah, I would say starting with high performer modeling. So, like, you have to start with knowing what good looks like. And if you don't know what good looks like, then you're not going to know how to assess it in the interview process. And then you're not going to be able to measure how effective your interview process is, right? So, starting with high performer modeling. And then from there, you can derive any proxy for quality of hire. So, again, it can be, you know, most ATSs have an interview scorecard. We use Greenhouse. So yes, strong, yes, 1 to 5. Essentially, it's a 1 to 5 scaled Likert score. You can take that 1 to 5 score from the hiring manager if you believe that they're the best predictor of success and use that as a proxy for quality of hire. So that's where I would start because most companies have that in place. And then from there, you just want to make sure that you're capturing that post hire data. Typically, it's performance because most companies do performance evaluations. And then you can go back and look and say, okay, I thought hiring manager score would be predictive of future performance score.
Right.
But when I look at it, and again, you don't have to do a quantitative analysis, you can just look at it qualitatively. When I look at it, they're rating people really high here, but then, once 6 months later, they're dropping off on their performance evaluation score. That's a sign that that probably isn't the right metric,
It's not the
right?
right proxy. Yeah.
And it's not the right process. You're probably not finding the right talent. So maybe you look at your recruiter score, or maybe you look
Yeah.
at your reference check score and use that as a proxy for quality of hire.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Awesome. So as we look at quality of hire in the industry today, I would almost say it's in vogue because of where the economy is, the fluctuations, the focus on efficiency, smaller TA teams. That's where we are today. Q1 2025. I'm curious where you see the tech industry, a year from now, and then a couple years from now, and then more granular. Where do you see talent teams and quality of hire evolving or shifting in these timeframes? Let's look at a year from now and then 3 years from now as sort of your crystal ball, Shauna formula. What are you thinking?
Yeah. So I think TA Tech right now is really focused on leveraging AI to drive efficiency. So you said it earlier, efficiency. And we're all talking about like how we leverage these tools to drive efficiency. And I think that that is a starting point. I think there's a lot of TA Tech that allow us to do that already. And we're starting to be able to appreciate the ROI and the value there. And I believe that's the best starting point. Now, over time, where we're going to see the most value is leveraging AI tech to drive effectiveness, right? So, an example of that is, it's similar to what I talked about before. We used to use a tool called Phenom. And what Phenom did was they were, a talent CRM, but also they helped us create our career site and host our career site. Well, what Phenom would do is they would take our job description and then they would match it with the ICP. So we could upload LinkedIn candidate profiles of people that fit our ICP criteria. We could also type in our ICP. So once we've defined our ICP, we could type in the ICP for that role. And then it would give a score to all of the candidates in our database based on that data. And it would stack rank them. So it was a grade. So the A plus candidates were always at the top. And that was such an opportunity to drive efficiency and effectiveness because the more you train the model, the more accurate it got. Our recruiters were like really just biased to go open the rack, go straight into Phenom, find the best candidates, start interviewing. And what that did was that allowed them to close more candidates quicker that are higher quality, but it also allowed them to do the things that they really wanted to do, which was spend more time with each candidate,
Building
to
relationships.
build
Yes.
relationships with hiring managers, to think critically about the business. So it actually kind of like supercharged them because they actually had the bandwidth to learn more about the business, to learn deeply about the role, to learn deeply about the candidate. And so they became more effective recruiters because of that. So it was a virtuous cycle. And so you're going to start to see, I think, companies, getting the efficiency gains and then focusing on effectiveness. And I think that's going to happen as soon as next year. There are some companies that are already appreciating the effectiveness gains, but I think it's going to happen as soon as next year, but definitely 3 years from now. We get the cost savings, we get the efficiency gains. They're all going to be focused on how are we driving better outcomes for the business based on our leveraging AI and TA tech.
Yeah, well said. I'll piggyback on that and say, whether it's Phenom or any other tool that's replacing administrative tasks, and whether you have a TA team that's full cycle recruiters and they're sourcing, scheduling, and closing, or you have bifurcation across the process, even through onboarding and rec ops, people ops, and if you're a head of talent at a startup, you're doing all those things. You're a one person shop, and we're seeing that blended role responsibility too, head of people, head of talent at smaller startups. And as companies get larger, they're looking at ways to reduce administrative tasks and increase efficiency through adopting tools or stacking different tools on top of each other. And I've said this before, but just to echo, looking at places across scheduling, interview intelligence, so the actual recording and digesting or synthesizing of an interview, and then scorecarding that. And there's interesting tools that can help you do that, whether you're looking at MetaView or BrightHire, and there's a variety of tools on that side of the stack. Of course, sourcing as well, and being able to not just sourcing databases and stack ranking, like you mentioned in ATS, or stack ranking your internal candidates in your CRM, but also when you're sourcing passive candidates. And we're seeing human in the loop AI sourcing tools be effective, and also full Copilot tools. And so I guess my message to talent leaders and people leaders is to investigate and research and measure where you can save time and money in your organization and where you're going to see an impact and an increase in the quality of hire downstream. Every company's size and stage is different, so it's not a one size fits all. Maybe a Phenom might not work for one company and did for another. And maybe, an interview intelligence tool might work in one organization. It might not work at scale or might not be the right fit, but investigate and look for ways you can do that. I'd say that's the largest request from the founders or C-suites of a company, is they're saying, hey, people leaders, where can we save money? And how are you going to implement AI into your process? The same way we're seeing the request in engineering, product design, sales teams as well. Right?
Yeah. The one thing I will say, Anders, is like this is such an exciting time because
It
this
is.
is an explosion of innovation. And often what you're seeing is those point solutions are adding so much value. I actually think we're going to see some consolidation happen in this space. And, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, talent leaders, they don't want 10 different point solutions. They're going to want everything integrated into the same stack.
Hot take. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll start to see some consolidation happen in this space.
Oh, I like um, so perhaps the 3 year forecast. And I agree. I think the 3 year forecast. Maybe we'll do a second podcast. Next year, and things will look towards consolidation, where instead of having, say, 20 tools in your TA stack that automate or implement AI across, sourcing, scheduling, that there will be a one-stop solution that does everything. And I think you're right, that consolidation will happen. We've seen that happen in sales teams. I even heard a forecast from a friend in the industry that their opinion was that talent and recruiting often follows and mirrors go-to-market teams, and there might be some weight to that. That's just anecdotal or observational from this friend of mine. But I think that in my corner of the sandbox, that might be true. And we're seeing. It makes me think of like we used to sort of have this. I think personalization is back, incredibly important in the recruiting process, where having personalization in outreach and in the relationship that you build is really important. And some of these tools that created so much noise from mass outreach are now actually having a paradoxical effect where there's less productivity. And so who knows, maybe the recruiting teams of the future will handwrite letters to home addresses. I don't know. Only time will tell, right,
Yeah.
Shauna?
Send cookies in the final stages of the process. No, absolutely. I agree with that sentiment, by the way. I do think that a lot of, our TA motion is very similar
Yeah.
to inbound marketing motion as well as outbound prospecting cadence. There's historically been a lot more investment in that space. And a lot of the players in the recruiting space are mimicking and mirroring those tools. And that's the smart thing to do because it's the same motion. It's just instead of acquiring a lead, you're looking to acquire a candidate. So it's great. It's all good news for us because the more tech advances, the better we become at our jobs, and the better we become, the more successful our companies are.
Well, that's why I love what we do. And I'm incredibly grateful for you joining the Lean In podcast today, Shauna. I learned so much. Listeners, I hope you did too. So tune in for the podcast post in a few weeks, and grateful for your time, and have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Anders. See ya.
Bye.